Okay, folks. Well, we really appreciate you all being here. I think we're going to get started because we have a lot we want to cover, and I know people will be chiming in or logging in fairly soon. So, welcome everybody. My name is Magali Thayas, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement. It's so great to see all your faces. And a quick ask: if connectivity allows, please turn your cameras on so the newer folks like me can match names to faces if we've not had a chance to meet. So we're very excited to be with you in this virtual community to take opportunity to dive into some items that pertain to where we are with the City of Santa Rosa's Violence Prevention Partnership. And we want to inform you that there are a lot of exciting opportunities and changes happening in our department. And we're ultimately looking to bring this like new energy in our work. So in that vein, we're super excited to announce that we do have a new GPS wraparound coordinator who will be Irma Cuevas, and she'll be joining us on August 2nd. Jason Carter's moved on to another position and is no longer the program manager. So we're looking at different ways to figure out what's going to be the most successful composition for this team moving forward. And we want to make sure that we make a connection for you all between our violence prevention strategic plan, the scorecard, and the new results-based accountability framework. So we also want to make sure we share an update on the 4 scorecard indicators tied to current funding strategies, collect feedback from you all, and who has a role to play in addressing the different indicators in our community. And we're going to have our staff from upstream staff, Holly White Wolf, and also Allison Carr here to help us provide technical information and a brief update on key indicators from the scorecard. And I'm super excited to have Ernesto Olivares and Serena Lino, who are here to bring their knowledge and history about this initiative. So we appreciate your knowledge, experience, expertise in your fields, and hope that we can better inform on where we are with everything and if we're on the right, and you can inform us if we're on the right path. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I forgot to ask you to put on the PowerPoint. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to line my PowerPoint too. So the members of the partnership operation team, you all play a very key role in turning our shared vision into positive results for Santa Rosa's youth. And our shared vision, which is what we have here, is that ultimately we want youth who are safe, healthy, and connected to their families, schools, communities, and future. And the city has a team, a tiny but mighty team that is doing this work. And we want to talk about how moving forward as a community engagement department, we're really marrying community engagement and the violence prevention, because it's our belief that if we do really great community engagement, we could really make a huge impact with violence prevention. So we're going to be also reviving committees that have been a bit dormant since the pandemic has happened, and it's really kind of put a damper on how we used to do and operate things. So we're going to be trying to reinvigorate the steering committee, the executive team, and some of these other components and elements of folks that we were working with. So if we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so today we're going to talk about how we're doing in terms of making this vision a reality. We'll review our history and what made us stop, take a pause as a community in the early 2000s, what's brought us together to craft this vision for our community now. And then we'll talk about where we find ourselves today as where the community is showing symptoms and roots of violence that are starting to pop up as we see these clusters of violence happening. And unfortunately, a lot of these having to do with our young people. We'll end with talking about a new tool that helps us keep an eye on those harmful roots while we implement programs that lead us to families thriving. So with that, I want to make sure that I introduce Ernesto Olivares, who's our Director of California Violence Prevention Network, and Serena Linau, who is the Admin Service Officer and also has been with the partnership for 18 years, and both of them collectively have been incredibly instrumental in helping me as a new person navigate violence prevention. So I'll kick it off to all y'all.
All right. Hello, everybody. Serena here. I recognize some of you. It's been about 3.5 years since I've been actively a part of the initiative, but as Magali said, it was definitely long time person, here in support of the efforts. So I'm very grateful to be able to be here today. Before I get started, Ernesto, you want to say a little quick opening?
A quick opening about what? About me? Or what?
Yeah, just a quick introduction and then we'll get started.
Oh, certainly. No, I'm happy to be back into the fold here with all of you. My history goes back probably before the 2000s, working with the police department and watching things change in our community in the back in 1990 or so, early 2000s. What we saw here in Santa Rosa was something that mirrored actually the nation, as we saw a rise in gang violence across our communities and trying to struggle and address and look at how we can address some of these issues. Historically, as you all know, we looked at these through more of a law enforcement lens, but clearly that was not working for us. We needed to own this issue as a community. And that's where we kind of evolved back in the early 2000s with the then Mayor's Gang Prevention Task Force. And I'll tell you, those of you who were around back in the 1995, early 2000s, remember what it used to be like in Santa Rosa. So let that kind of be a guide for you on how things have changed since we've taken ownership of this issue and partnered with law enforcement. They are only a partner in this effort with all of us to address these issues. But we have learned so much along the way. And fortunately for us too, being able to partner with other communities across the state and nationally to look to see what they are doing and how they're struggling with some of these similar issues. We've come a long way, and I'm excited to be here with all of you to try to see how we move forward together.
Thank you. And so before we kick it off with a little bit of a history, we wanted to do a quick poll just for fun, just to see, for those of you who are here, to tell us how long you've been a part of the partnership. So I'm going to ask Madeline to pull that up. If you could just take a moment to just click on what's most relevant for you. I'll leave it to Madeline to tell us when everybody's responded. All right. So we have quite a spectrum of years of participation in the effort. So I don't know if Ernesto, you want to say anything, but I just think it's remarkable to see those who have been here a long time and have been continued partners through this effort, as well as those who are newer to the effort. And we thank you for being here. And each of you plays a very critical role in the work that we do. And really helps to underscore the importance of this more well-rounded, comprehensive approach to dealing with violence in our community. So
yeah, this is good information here, Serena, because again, it shows those that have been at it for quite a while, and then there's so many new people that have jumped on board too. And this is good because in doing this work, we continue to evolve. Many of us started where we kind of only had really only a handful of tools to deal with some of these issues. But it's always good to have fresh perspectives as new folks come on board. It's wonderful for me to see Gina Kuklis from the county school board here. Again, education is a big partner, but it's good to have that balance of a broad base of community effort to make this happen, because there's no one agency or no one person that's going to make the change. We have to do it together. We have to stick together to make it happen. But we will always be looking for new members to come on board to help revive and revitalize our efforts too. We'd never want to get stale, and believe me, we won't get stale because there's just so much happening around us. So this is good, and so it's good to see the different little categories here as far as longevity with this effort as well.
Yeah. Well, and so for Ernesto and I, it's today is exciting because it demonstrates a really, I think, a turning point in the overall initiative by diving in a little bit deeper to connecting the dots of all of the work that we're doing and creating a measurement tool, which we did with the scorecard, but now we're evolving it to take it one step further by making some direct links to the efforts that we have been doing and maybe understanding how those efforts have affected the curve when you look at it from a data perspective. So next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about the curve, turning the curve, what does that actually mean? So when you think about it from a data perspective, it really allows us to analyze the trends from a data perspective over time. So we look at these different indicators and the data will tell us to go up and down and up and down. We have spikes, we have dips, and so on. So what it does is it helps us to understand, you know, the deeper meaning of what's behind the curve. So what are some of the anecdotal stories, or what are some of the efforts that may have influenced an uptick or a downtick? So we use this framework to look at the measure of well-being, like community safety, right? And to determine if these things are trending in a positive direction or not. And what it does is it opens a dialogue for all of us to have conversations around what could we be doing differently, what could we collectively be doing to influence what the data is telling us to move it in a positive direction. It helps to inform what types of investments we as the city via the Choice Grant Program we're going to make as well, right? We utilize the tax dollars, which we're so fortunate to have, to invest in direct strategies that could hopefully make that shift as well. And then Ernesto, do you want to weigh in as well when we think about what's happening now?
Yeah, there's so many things that influence the work that we do. And clearly we had a big impact last year with the pandemic. That was a big game changer for us. And I think it really impacted us to the point where it was difficult to connect with the youth and families that we have been working with for so many years. And this did not just happen here in Santa Rosa. In conversation with communities across the state, they dealt with some of these same issues. And it's not so much that they weren't able to connect with their clients and people that they work with. A lot of their work was redirected because of the pandemic as well. There were so many other things that we needed to do to get through that. And this was a big unknown for us, not knowing where we were heading. And now it's time to start picking that up again. But again, as far as trends, we look at what happened during the pandemic, where right after the pandemic, we started to see a major decline in violent crime. And then suddenly here we are, it's rearing its ugly head now. Now across the country, we're seeing a rise in homicides, violent crime, even here locally. We've been seeing what's happening here. So it's unfortunate that we had to go through that terrible year because it impacted us in so many ways. But I think that some of the impacts too of it was the trauma that it caused to our communities. It was devastating in so many ways. It was almost demoralizing sometimes, and but this work is so important though that even here locally, the partnership continued to do what it can do in trying to continue to mobilize folks and respond to the needs as they develop. Because from day to day, we did not know what was going to happen next. But I think we're now getting into some stable ground where we can kind of refocus and look to where we head. But I tell you, to put it in perspective for me, you talk about anecdotal information and stories. Some of you who were here back in 1995, early 2000s, one of the things, an event that stands out for me personally in our community was Cinco de Mayo. And those of you who were around back in the day, on Cinco de Mayo, regardless of what day of the week it was, seemed to be the day that a lot of our youth went out to the streets, and there was a lot of violent incidents that were occurring. And again, back then, our response was law enforcement. What we did, and what I saw even as a law enforcement officer, was early on in the early 1990s, was seeing this increase in violent crime that occurred on Cinco de Mayo day. And our response was we would add more enforcement to it. Year after year, we would see more activity in the streets, we would add more enforcement to it and continue to add more enforcement to it. I believe that at its peak, we probably were deploying about 100 extra officers out of the streets of Santa Rosa, not just Santa Rosa police officers, but borrowing from other jurisdictions to try to deal with the issue. And it was those kinds of wake-up calls, I think, that caused us to look at the issue of rising violence in our community a little bit differently, and looking at taking ownership. And it's really, having a foundation of shared accountability and shared responsibility in how we address these issues. But because we mobilized and came together to try to address it, we made that change where over the years, the number of incidents started to reduce on Cinco de Mayo. And I believe, back when we were having our festivals, which was a big game changer for us in Santa Rosa, we would have only a handful of officers out, and they were at the festival interacting with families. Those are the kind of things, if you've been around, that you remember that that change does happen, and it happens to be because we took ownership of it and we started doing things a little bit differently.
Yeah. And I think that now if we bring it full circle to kind of what the current times are, so, you've been reading a lot in the headlines around the gun violence issues that have been going on. So it's a perfect example of something that's relevant and timely that we collectively can do, where we can pull our resources together, utilize this graphic, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through the slides. But basically the idea is that we'll pull resources, and Magali and Gustavo are already having some of those conversations. Some of you may already be involved with that. But the idea is to try to understand what the root is of what's going on, and then pull each of you together to address it from your own particular perspectives, because you each have such a valuable perspective to contribute that's unique and different than what, say, the city can do. So we want to leverage this relationship and these partnerships to really help the community. Next slide, please.
Yeah, well, we have here guiding frameworks, roots of community violence, and looking at families that are disconnected from community. It's interesting, back in the early 1990s, how we used to talk about, people would say that a lot of these issues happen in the home. They happen in the home. It's the parent's responsibility. But it's so interesting how we learn more and really start looking at some of these root causes of the things that we're dealing with. It's not that. It's really that disconnection that we have. It's the importance of the role models that we have in our children's lives. It's ensuring that we balance our work, that law enforcement doesn't see itself just as law enforcement, but also playing a role in our prevention and intervention efforts as well, and how we blend some of these things and how we adapt and roll with it. But it's so critical that we look at things like education, for example, which from my perspective is key. And I challenge people every day when they talk about gang violence, for example, and other types of violence, is go out there and find me a gang member today with a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree, lucky to find one with a high school diploma. We know that education is key, that if we help our kids be successful in school, they're less likely to be involved in high-risk behavior and criminal activity as well. And that family connectedness is how do we reconnect our kids with their families and their communities and their neighborhoods and support them. How do we look at reentry efforts and not looking at people differently because they've gone off and had to spend time incarcerated, whether it was jail or prison. But these are our residents. These are people's children, people's parents, members of our community, and not looking at them like something else when they come back home, and looking at them instead not as ex-cons per se, but to look at them as returning residents to our community. And what is our obligation and duty as a community to welcome them home and help them be successful when they're ready to go down that path, whether it's reconnecting with services, reconnecting with education. There's just so many other aspects of that. And health too. I mean, we have issues of access to health, dental care. There's so many other little underlying factors that cause some of the things that happen in our community. Poverty. I mean, even as a community, early on, we never really talked about that or look at some of the indicators related to unemployment and poverty, housing. There's just so many other aspects that contribute. There's no one thing that causes our youth to go down a certain path, and there's no one thing that will help them get out. That's why it's important for us to look at this as a community-wide effort, identify some of the root causes, and also identify what some of those programs and services that may be successful to address it are going to be important as well. And how we balance that. Again, we often talk about a balance of prevention, intervention, the enforcement or the suppression, and the reentry as well. And balance doesn't mean equal. It doesn't mean we do the equal amount in each one. We have to be nimble and move along. Early on, when we first started, like I said, back in the early 1990s and 2000s, it was enforcement. We had to stop the bleeding in Santa Rosa, and I think we did that by working together at it. But I think over time, one of the primary goals, and that's why I like looking at some of these issues through more of a public health perspective, and a public health lens, if you will, is not just treating the issues, but how we look at the underlying factors and how do we address those root causes and try to move more towards a prevention mode. We will never be done because there will always be work for us to do in prevention. But how do we start moving the needle, and how do we identify some of those benchmarks and some of those goals that we want to set, and how do we share this information with the community too, so that they know where to put some of their efforts too in moving the needle in some of these different areas. So I think it's critically important for us to work together and identify that. And, and also looking at, some of the things that are even on this slide here. For example, government is not well organized or held accountable. If government is a partner, and I'll be honest with you, even myself, having served as a council member for 12 years here in Santa Rosa, sometimes government gets in the way. And I'll admit that. It's sometimes it's a little bit too bureaucratic. But at the end, government has to be a partner. They have to be at the table. There are so many different partners that have to be at the table to make this happen. It's not just one organization, but it's groups like this and others in our community that need to have that voice and build that voice to say, government, we need you, because oftentimes they are also the ones that can help us identify the resources that we need. And even here locally with the passage of Measure O many years ago, that was really vital to giving us that head start and moving forward to help fund some of the programs that we needed to address some of the issues that we're dealing with in our community.
Before we go to the next slide, I'll just add real quick too that when we created the scorecard in 2016, it was really, well, if I back up even further, when we changed the name of the initiative from the Mayor's Gang Prevention Task Force to the Santa Rosa Violence Prevention Partnership, it was really to highlight the fact that we were moving away from being so specific about gang violence. Task force can kind of come off as being harsh, and it was really detracting from what our core mission was and what we were trying to accomplish. And then, as you know, gang prevention, violence prevention wasn't necessarily a explicit effort back in the early 2000s. I remember when Measure O came and like literally overnight, we became gang prevention. And so we were trying to figure it out as we went. It's like that whole concept of building a bicycle while you're riding it, right? And so as time goes on, things evolve. And so we evolved as well, because we recognize you can't be stagnant and such a dynamic process. So then introduce the scorecard. Traditionally, we always just looked at program level data through the grant program, and then sort of crime and safety and a little bit of the California Healthy Kids Survey, for those of you who remember when we used to do that. And so the scorecard was really a way for us to recognize that we can't just look at those isolated indicators as well as only programmatic outcomes. We really needed to look at population level data to understand what is going on in the community that is influencing and really undermining a lot of these efforts, right? And creating the issues that we were seeing. So we had to take a step back and look at it from a bigger perspective. And so that was when the scorecard came into play. That's why we look at these root causes of community violence. It's to help us understand it from that public health perspective. So next slide.
And many cities are doing that now too, Serena, as far as moving away from that, because you're right. I mean, a lot of the focus going back to the 1990s was focused on gang violence. But again, these kids just didn't wake up one day and decide to be gang members. There's a lot of other issues that occur. But as we learn more, many cities are moving away from focusing solely on gang violence to looking at violence in general in our communities. And I think even the biggest change for us too was moving away from that name of the Mayor's Gang Prevention Task Force, because and again, it was necessary at the time, I believe. But I think as we grew and expanded, and also trying to help the community feel like they belong to this effort. And I think being a part of a partnership is more compelling to people. Say, yes, I want to be a part of a partnership to make this change. It's difficult sometimes for people to say, well, okay, I'm going to be part of this task force. What does that mean? I'm going to be going out there kicking down doors and doing some wild and crazy stuff. But that's not what it's about. So I think being more welcoming to the community to want to participate, because at the end, it's not just us as organizations and people doing this work that is important. It's also how do we engage our community members to play an active role in this as well? Because again, we all own it, so we all have to find our role to play in it.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely. And so here are the indicators, which I think underscore what Ernesto was talking about. We all have a role to play, right? So some of you were involved with the scorecard process when we did that. It's crazy to think how long it's been. But you know, when you take that public health approach, we had so many deliberation or so many discussions around what do we pick? How do we measure this? Like, what does it all mean? And there are, you know, you could have a list of 100 different indicators or 100 different sources, metric sources. Like, how do you narrow this down? So after months and months and months in a committee and utilizing the operational team, the community policy team, these are the indicators that we came up with. And then they're in these broader categories of economic conditions, crime and safety, family and community connectedness, and school conditions. So to Ernesto's point, kids just, you know, youth don't wake up one day and say, I want to be a gang member. Like, there's reasons for it. And these population level data sources are going to help us understand what's going on. And then the scorecard itself, when you look at it, is really a place-based approach. So while we have these population level data sources, we also honed in on specific high needs areas. So we use the youth violent crime data point as a way to measure where those hotspots are or high needs areas. And so the idea is that you target and invest in those areas to really help turn the curve. So, so these are the ones we landed on. Again, could have been, you know, who knows how many. That Holly and Geraldine are going to get into this piece a little bit more about so what now. So I'll pause there with further explanation, but we'll get more into it. So what are we going to do with this information now? Next slide, please. So this framework is, it's very similar to like a logic model where, you know, we have the result that we're working towards, the mission, why are we doing all of this? And then so the partnership is identified, you know, that all Santa Rosa youth are healthy, safe, connected to their families, community, schools, communities, and futures, like Magali mentioned at the beginning. So that's what we're all working towards. That's the common goal. And then we said, you know what, all right, how are we going to measure that? How do we know that we're making a dent in that, like making some sort of positive progress? So that's where the indicators come into play. So this is how we're measuring it. And then we said, okay, so the scorecard identified a number of different strategies, which we'll highlight on the next slide. But from there, we narrowed it down to these 4 areas. So workforce development, school and community connectedness, school engagement and truancy prevention, and street outreach and mediation. So we've said collectively, if we're going to invest dollars, these are going to be the places that we're going to invest in because we feel like we're going to have the biggest impact and can make the most positive or well attempt to make a positive effort or impact. Excuse me. And then we said, okay, so within these different categories, we identified specific programs that we're going to fund, and then furthermore, those programs that we're funding are going to have their specific performance measures that all link all the way back up to what the overall result is that we're trying to work towards. Next slide, please. Next one, please. So this is what I was alluding to. So these are the scorecard recommendations that we ultimately came up with, and the ones that are highlighted are the specific pillars that we felt were going to really have that impact that we're looking for, where it made sense for us to invest dollars in. So it's implement workforce development opportunities, implement place-based violence prevention strategies, programs, and services that really ties directly to those high need areas that I was referencing. Increase school readiness opportunities and increase school engagement and truancy prevention. Because as we all know, when you look at it from an upstream approach, the earlier you can make these investments and be more preventative, the less you're going to have downstream on the back end, right? So if we can really target resources in the upstream school readiness before they get into school, then we are hopeful that we'll have the better outcomes. Next slide, please. And just as a reminder, these are the programs that we are currently funding, many of which have been funded for 4 years or more. This scorecard and what we're going to do today is really going to aim at focusing on these particular programs that we're funding. And this is where we're going to, oh, my cat's in the background. this is what we're going to be focusing on today, and this is where we're going to be asking for some feedback from you. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're going to pause here for a moment, take a break, and we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So I'll pause here and I'll just ask for any questions. Does anyone have any thoughts or any questions at this point?
Don't be shy. Please
Yeah.
ask. Please challenge assumptions. Do it. Yeah. Please speak up. This is important work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, you know, that what Ernesto and I, what we were attempting to do is to ground us in what the next step of the agenda is going to be, which is where we're going to, Holly and Geraldine are going to go over what the results-based accountability framework is and what we're hoping to achieve and what the outcome is going to look like. But this was really intended to ground you, and let's get ourselves into the mindset of what the history was, how far we've come, how this has evolved, and it's going to continue to evolve. And as you know, the measure's almost up. 2024 is right around the corner. And so we're really trying to do our part to get really clear and be able to communicate our successes and, you know, the areas that we still need to evolve. And so anyhow, any thoughts? If not, we can go ahead and go to a quick 5-minute break.
I'm kind of new to this group. I took Major Rio Ray's place. I'm Major Randy Hart, Salvation Army here in Santa Rosa. Yeah, I actually had quite a bit of experience with this and various other appointments. As a CPO of the Salvation Army Boys and Girls Club in Yuma, Arizona, we did anti-bullying campaigns, lots of them, anti-gang prevention, lots of career days for kids, trying to move apprenticeship programs, etc. Done it in our Kroc Center in Suisun City. Now I'm here. So I am anxious just to be part of this. This is a huge part of my heart. So.
And we thank you. We thank you, Major, for being a part of this effort, you know, and your interaction with us. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I really see our, not just the TAM program, but the Double Punches program as well as being, is very vital. But I know there's so many programs here, but this is truly a great coalition. So excited to be part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to have you. All right, let's see here. Magali, do you have any thoughts, or do you want to go ahead and go to a break?
Well, I kind of wanted to poll folks and see if y'all just want to kind of power through how people are feeling on powering through, or if you all just need, there's just a lot of information, if you need a little quick 5-minute break or just want to keep on keeping on. Thumbs up for keep on keeping on. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, it looks like we're just keep on keeping on. So I'm going to turn it over to Geraldine.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you here. Over the past year, partnership staff has been working with our funded choice partners to adopt the results-based accountability framework. As we've discussed today, this framework links the results we seek, or our vision, and our strategies, the 4 pillars, to our programs and their performance. We'll soon be releasing a report that shows an update of our choice-funded partners and their performance measures. In the report, you will see what we are tracking. Please take a look at the right-hand side of the slide. You will see sample agency performance measures. So this is the framework that the agency started with to develop their performance measures. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? And you can see here on the slide, we're using workforce development as an example. So number of youth served during choice cycle, percentage of youth that report positive interactions with agency staff, percentage of youth that sustained non-subsidized employment 6 months after program completion. What's being missed from our process has been a clear connection between the population level indicators, which we get from our scorecard, and the strategies we've chosen. We need at least one population level indicator to match with each pillar. Once we have this, we'll have all the elements of results-based accountability framework in place and aiming toward one clear strategic direction. I'm going to turn it over to Holly now and with Upstream, and she has been very diligently working on this process and reviewing and researching the scorecard to identify which indicators should match each pillar.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. It's been a pleasure to partner with the City of Santa Rosa over the last 2 years, really, to bring the results-based accountability framework to life. And thank you to all the partners in the room who've worked with us on logic model development and survey development and figured out how we can measure how well we're doing and is anyone better off. And I'd ask Madeline if we could advance the next slide. Thank you so much. So as we've all talked about today, we've done a lot of groundwork in the past to identify where we want to go and how we'll measure how our community is doing on that path. So we had this long list, as Serena said, of indicators that helped us understand the community need and how we kind of match up to our vision of well-being and safety. But the list is pretty long and it doesn't quite match up to the 4 pillars that we have. And so our task today is to see how we might whittle that list down and get strategic and focused by having maybe one indicator from each domain or the appropriate domains that match our pillars. So what I've done here on the screen is kind of made a little visual map, and I thought I'd walk through it with the group. Take a pause for a moment and see if you have any feedback for me or any insights, thoughts on what I might have missed or what else is important to consider. But if we look at workforce development, I'll start with the easy one. I think you'll agree with me that the indicator that seems the most obvious to select would be unemployment. So again, if the domain we're concerned with is economic conditions and the pillar or strategy that we selected is workforce development, of all the 4 different indicators on the list, employment seems to be the most obvious and most relevant. Again, if we want to be able to talk to our programs and say, tell us about how you're doing with your clients, are you making a difference? Great, let's take a pause and look at how the overall community is doing. Do we see any trends we need to pay attention to? Unemployment would be a great measure. So then turning to street outreach, intervention, and mediation, it makes sense that we would pick an indicator from the crime and safety list there. It's a little tougher for me to specifically narrow in on a measure, but I am recommending that we use youth violent crime and the measure of youth that have been involved in those crimes. I talked to the police department and they let me know that that measure means any youth that has been the victim of crime or who has actually been a perpetrator of the crime. And both are very important in our community. Not only that, the police department tracks exactly where these crimes take place. So we have that neighborhood picture where we can see where we want to connect our efforts. And clearly we're trying to help youth limit the exposure to any type of violent crime, whether they're involved in it or acting on it. And the idea is if we've got our street outreach and intervention, folks out there connecting with families, getting them the resources that they need, we're going to make the difference. So it seems to me that's the right measure. If we want to see where to target our efforts and are we making a difference, at least at the community level, that's probably the best measure. Again, if folks have further input or ideas about maybe a different measure to select, I'm open to hearing that today. And then the final 2 pillars that we have, they're both related to school conditions. So as you can see down in that blue kind of shaded box there at the bottom, I've got 2 indicators selected, one for each pillar. And particularly if we're looking at school engagement and truancy prevention, it seems to make a lot of sense. We're concerned about attendance. That's a good way to measure engagement. And specifically, we had looked at truancy rates as a measure. And I do think we could look again at the truancy rates, but our thinking has evolved like it has. We've talked about oftentimes today. We've learned a few things about how to understand our community needs. And truancy is just one measure of school engagement. And it seems that chronic absenteeism may be a better measure. That captures truancy, but it also captures all absence, excused or not. And absence from school is what we know leads to low levels of engagement or low levels of performance for students. And that's what we're concerned with. So I think I'm going to come back to you and show both measures and we'll decide which one we want to select. And then for school readiness, kind of a similar thing. Here we're looking at early childhood education as one of the measures we selected in the past. And at that time, we would count the number of licensed childcare facilities in operation and how many slots they had for serving families. So if a provider in Roseland was operating a preschool, we would check to see, well, how many children can they serve? And it might be 30, and we put that all together on our information maps. Well, that's really important information. And again, we might see something like childcare deserts that have resulted from the pandemic that forced a lot of home preschools and childcare centers to close. So that is a data point we might want to consider. However, if our pillar is really focused on school readiness, the upstream investments team has been collecting a measure of school readiness for several years now. So I think I can get you data from 2016 through last year, at least, when before the pandemic, when schools closed. But we issue an observational exam. Each teacher kind of observes all children to see if they're ready for school. And they have a special validated survey tool for checking if the kids are emotionally, socially ready, how they are doing with basic things like maybe knowing how to spell a name or identify a shape. And they come up with a score to see how ready kids are for school. So we have a direct measure of school readiness if we'd like to use that. And I'll also be bringing that data back to you for consideration in the future. Our goal is that I will develop by December our specific new measures and new data that we can show a trend line. And we'll be putting this online on a platform where you can see those measures that Geraldine talked about earlier at the program level in relationship to these indicators. So it won't be a full-blown scorecard update for every measure. It will be the measures that are currently connected to our work. But that certainly doesn't mean that these other measures aren't important or we might not want to turn back to them someday. It would be up to this group during the strategic planning process and also our request for proposal developments for distributing those choice grant dollars to decide if maybe there's another area of concern that's more relevant today. As an example, family and community connectedness, you'll notice there is no pillar that's currently linked to that work, and therefore there's no indicator that we're going to be tracking this year. But that does not mean it's not important. And certainly given the pandemic, the triple kind of experiences of trauma that many people have had lately. We talk about the fires, the race equity issues, the pandemic, that's all led to a lot of trauma for families. But maybe we want to refocus some of our efforts in that domain again. But for now, I'm recommending these 4 indicators will be the ones that we move forward with this time to help us keep an eye on if we're making a difference at the community level. So after kind of hearing that and considering our next move of kind of gathering some data for you later on this year, does anyone have some feedback or thoughts for me? I'd be very open to hearing it.
I'll go ahead and begin. I wanted to say that I'll make an assumption here that even though we're not targeting family trauma, that we still will be addressing trauma through any of these, because clearly that is a big issue, not just in our community, but in many communities as well. And then the other thing too is just in doing this work, it's also having common language that we use too. And I guess for the purposes of this slide is getting a clear definition of youth violent crime. What age group are we talking about when we're talking about that?
Oh, that is a good question. The police department asked me that specifically. I mean, really, I could hear back from this group, but I think we made it 12 through 24.
Okay.
And that they had proposed that as they had grouped data in different ways. And I think that's how they had grouped it. So I said that made sense. But if this group is concerned about other age groups or thinks that's too long, all the way through 24 is too far to consider it a youth, or down to 12 isn't low enough, I'd certainly be open to hearing that. And we could ask the police department if they have data organized in that way.
Yeah, I think that's where the data comes into play, because it's, I mean, looking at this, we say, okay, our community is at risk because of our youth. And we think about kids, right? They're terrorizing our community. So who are the offenders that are committing violent crime? Are they the early 20s? How far up do we go? It may not be higher up. So I think that'll be important to clarify somewhere along the line here, that when we're talking about youth violence, we have a specific age group that we're talking about. So we're not excluding young adults in some of the work that we're trying to do as well.
Thank you, Ernesto, for your expertise. Your former experience with our Santa Rosa Police Department has come in handy many times in these conversations. Thank you.
What category does recruiting fit into this? Because I know gangs that are actively recruiting.
Well, that's an interesting question about categorizing. So basically what we're looking at here are the domains that we identified based on the roots of community violence. So we said,
Sure.
Here are the kind of, categories, if you will, that we're considering. And then we came up with indicators that match those domains. So
Sure.
recruitment, I mean, in my mind, I guess we'd all have to talk about where that fits. I mean, we have a measure,
Exactly,
we had an
sure.
indicator around gang involvement. And so
Yeah.
part of involvement could be recruitment. And if we had some
Yes.
type of measure for that, we could track it. At this time, we did hear Major at a former meeting that the police departments had some trouble tracking specifically gang
Recruitment.
data, that they changed their data system and they also lost their gang unit for some time. And so
Sure.
between the loss of staff and the loss of the tracking system, we're not confident that any data that we have related to gangs is very accurate for
Okay.
recent years. But it's a very good question.
And I think too, correct me if I'm wrong, Gustavo, but I think some of that would also be part of that street outreach. It's kind of what we're learning and hearing out of the community in the work that we're doing there, and learning that we have an uptick, for example, of kids being recruited into gangs or not.
Yeah, part of the recruitment effort is always tied around violence. So the recruitment effort itself is, if you want to be in the gang, you have to go and perform violent activities within the community. So I think that the indicator that we do have, that you guys were able to identify here with the youth involved violent crime indicator per 1,000 youth, I think that's the perfect indicator for that.
Good.
Thank you, Gustavo.
And I'm not proposing, Holly, that we change the youth violent crime, just as long as we define it in whatever documents that we have. So when we're using that common language, there may be other phrases that we use just to make sure there's clarity in there. So there's no confusion that we're only focusing on people under the age of 18, for example.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity to be reminded to be specific. In the Clear Impact Dashboard, this tool we're going to be using to share all of this data, we have a lot of opportunity to cite the reference of where we got this data, to describe the data more specifically. There's a little box that lets us talk about what's the story behind the curve. So if we know, for example, in our community, there's been some particular events that might be leading up to this, we could highlight that. If there's research that helps us understand this problem better, we might summarize some of that with links to it. So like the scorecard, we do hope to bring a lot of information together to bear for our community, so that we have at our fingertips the information we need to be thoughtful about our interventions and our supports that we're offering to families.
Great.
And I just also want to respond to folks saying that there's stories out there that we're collecting. So there are lots of types of data, and I do not want to say that just because something's published in a report or tracked by the police department or by upstream investments, that means it's more credible. So these are some measurements that are available that we can use to bring back to this group, but there is always the story, there's your lived experience, there's the photos that we gather, there's lots of different types of data, if you will, out there in the community, and it's all valid and it's all important. And every piece of math data, like a metric that I'm going to bring to you, there's always something to say about it. Like, well, we missed a couple of months of the data, or there's this problem in the data, we couldn't quite narrow in on this neighborhood, so we had to put two together. Like, there's some story that always means that the number's not quite right. And that's why we'll always bring them to you and say, what do you think about these numbers? Do they resonate? Do you know more? What is the story behind the curve or these numbers? So just, again, want to center the fact that your experiences and what you see is incredibly important. And also the data that we're able to track is usually pretty old. I mean, the most recent data I'll be able to bring to you in most cases, especially because of what happened in 2020, maybe 2019 data. And you'll know better what's happening today on the street. So we need both. We need some of these metrics and we need you and your stories. And if there aren't any further questions, I think I'm ready to turn it back to Magali.
Okay, thank you, Holly. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of gathering the data and facts to help continue to bring our community forward. And so we just want to, talk a little bit more about how do we turn the curve. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Allison from Upstream. That's going to give us a little bit more about this piece on turning the curve and the conversation process that is key. And we're going to do an activity around that. So Allison, over to you.
Thanks, Magali, and thank you to all of you for being here. I appreciate you participating with us. We're going to have a fun activity. We're going to ask for your thoughts and your input, and I hope that I'll be clear enough. I'm sure you can tell I'm a little nervous, so please bear with me as I get my feet under me here. So in the language of results-based accountability, we've been having the beginnings of a turn the curve conversation here. We've been talking about how we're doing, and how we got to where we are. We've heard a little bit about the history and the strategies and the data that we currently have available. And you've heard a little bit about our plan to collect more so that we can further clarify how we're doing. The other parts of a turn the curve conversation are, what is the story behind the curve? Who are the partners who have a role to play in turning the curve? What works to turn the curve? And what is our action plan to turn the curve? Today, we'd like to bring you, our partners, in to help us answer questions 2 and 3. What is the story behind the curve? How did we get to where we are? And why are we doing the way that we're doing? I mean, these things could be structural, programmatic, circumstantial. This is more of a brainstorming session than anything else. And then question 3, who are the partners who have a role to play in turning the curve? Who are our stakeholders? Who can we call on to be involved? Who do we need to help us? And who could we bring to the table that would help us to amplify our efforts to make a greater impact? Madeline, if you'll stop sharing, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and show you our all right. I'm having a little bit of troubles here, but I think that I will just be, sorry, here's my notes. So here we go. So here's a Google Jamboard. Madeline is going to share the link to this in the chat in a little bit. We're going to put you into breakout groups, and you'll each have a staff member with you to kind of help guide you through this exercise if you have any questions. And you can see that the questions 2 and 3 are here. What is the story behind the curve? Who are the partners who have a role to play in turning the curve? Up at the top right-hand corner, you'll see there's a group number. So please look at the group number in your breakout group to make sure that you're operating on the correct Jamboard. And I would recommend that you pick one person to be your recorder to make the sticky notes for this activity. And then we'd also ask that you pick one person to be your reporter. So after 10 minutes with your breakout group, you'll come back and report out for 5 minutes. I'll ask you to explain maybe one of your notes to the greater group, and then the city and the Violence Prevention Partnership will keep this Jamboard so that we have all your wonderful ideas here to move forward. To add a sticky note, if you come over to the left, you'll see sticky note. Click here, and here you can, if you press save, you can also change colors if you have a color preference, or if you want to make a very colorful Jamboard. Save, and then you can click cancel to get out of the note. You can move these notes around or make them bigger. And then when we come back, you can share your input. So do I have any questions about the how to do this activity, or about the questions that we're asking you to address in your breakout group?
Allison, do you mind?
Oh, sorry, Holly. I think
I was just going to say probably the same thing you were, Magali, but can you show us how to change the group?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So here you see group 1 in the top right-hand corner. If we click next frame, you'll see group 2. So then you'll be able to get to your correct group just by clicking through here. Thank you, Holly.
And then another quick question, Allison, can you give us a little more like, or an example of what you're looking for here? And then what is the story behind the curve? Sure.
So there are a lot of reasons that contribute to how we get to where we're at today. Maybe the most obvious one that, as Holly said, the data won't be available yet, but is the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you would like to, that's part of the story of why we are where we are. And we can, and once we have identified all these reasons like that we got to the place that we're at, we can work on strategies to address them. That's sort of the circular nature of that results-based accountability, turn the curve conversation. So the story behind the curve, we're looking for any reasons behind why we are here today.
Thank you.
And I think what we mean by why we are where we are here today, like all those kinds of references, what we mean is we're reading headlines in the newspaper in the morning about erupting gang violence or gun violence, I'm sorry. or other types of violence in general. And these symptoms of violence in our community mean something to us, especially if we consider the roots of violence. So if you could say, you know, what you think families are experiencing or what could be contributing to this toxic stress kind of coming up in our community, that's what we're looking to hear today. So maybe not just like a quick fact, the pandemic happened, of course we know that, but particularly how is it impacting families and driving people to the point of desperation?
Right. What specifically about the pandemic? So is it isolation? Is it job loss? That kind of a thing. Any questions, or should I ask Madeline to send us all to breakout groups? Madeline, you can go ahead and you'll. Okay, everyone, welcome back. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. I'm going to bring up the Jamboard here. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. I know the group that I was in, we were having a robust conversation and we didn't get to everything we wanted to get to. So I just thank you so much for you know, working within our time constraints and being understanding with that. Let's start with a report out from group 1. Do you want to go ahead?
Okay, I guess so. I'm going to report out for group 1. We did not have enough time, but we were talking about, you know.
Oh, I'm sorry, Gina. I should be more clear on what I would like you to do. Can you share one of the posts, one of the notes that you have here about the story behind the curve? Just one, please.
Okay, just one. Well, I'll talk about one that probably other groups may not have talked about because there's some real common, I think, common issues. And that is we're talking about the very, very early years, the isolation of new moms, the impact on babies, because the first 1,000 days is like actually the most critical time in a child's development and brain development. And if moms and haven't been having the supports that they need, because they've been isolated or services haven't been provided, and then moving forward with community partners to address that. And yeah, there's a list of them, but that's one thing we talked about.
Thank you. Group 2, can you share one of your notes about the story behind the curve?
Yeah, I want to say, I think the one that kind of is inclusive of a lot of the things that we talked about was the COVID restrictions prevented ability to participate in support groups, crimes, of easy opportunities. Really, our resources almost dropped out of sight in many cases when the pandemic hit. And then from there, the distance learning aspect, became ineffective in many cases, lack of parental supervision, all of these things surrounded by this COVID thing, or over parental, you know, hovering and stimulation. Either ways, those are some of the things you can see spread out here that kind of fall under this. I think COVID was a big catalyst for some of this. So.
Oh, thank you. Group 3, can you share one of your notes about the story behind the curve?
Yes, so for group 3, kind of similar to what other people were saying, there's a lot of stress financially, a lot of stress on the families, and definitely, you know, lack of supervision, and, you know, families have been, oh, you said just one, right? I guess just basically the children have to take up more responsibility for what the parents are, you know, either, you know, really stressed about finding jobs or being overworked at their jobs, and kind of how that just falls on the kids, and like, you know, families needing more resources because of that, and making it, like, especially with childcare, like it's still very difficult to find childcare for the parents, and so and having to pay for it. So I think that should be it, unless Sandra, you want to mention anything else?
No, thank you. I think you got it.
Thank you, Benny. I think that our group talked a little bit about that too, about teens maybe being pulled into childcare, and our youth just not having the life experience or the resilience to deal with all the demands of the pandemic. Group 4, can you share one of your notes about the story behind the curve?
So the one of the two that we did one about the COVID-19 effects on distance learning and how that, affects young people all that are in school. And some of the partners we talked about were like, obviously the schools, but Child Parent Institute, Boys and Girls Club, Salvation Army, CHOPS Teen Club, City of Santa Rosa Neighborhood Services, hospitals, and mental health providers as being good ways to help support those young people.
Thank you, Michelle. I think you're right on. It seems like the schools are going to be such an important partner in our recovery here and our reconnection. Group 5, this is so colorful. I like the creative visual aspect of your Jamboard. Can you share, please, one of your notes on the story behind the curve?
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Ernesto. A lot of good comments so far, but I want to bring the perspective of the elimination of the gang unit, because I think that was critical of looking at what's going on right now as far as the increase in homicides and shootings, is that I think it forced us and it forced them to be more in a reactive mode instead of being more proactive with us and not being able to do the work they need to gather information for us to be able to respond to hotspots and do the work that we need to do collectively in addressing some of these issues.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that perspective. Magali, is there anything that you would like to touch on more or anything you'd like to discuss further before we take it back to the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I just really appreciate everybody's perspective. And I think this was such a great exercise because as we got into who the partners were, we realized there were a lot of folks like, in these spaces, and there are many other people that we need to be bringing into the conversation. And we had a really, I think, poignant point, I guess, about the huge need to have hospitals maybe have a larger role in this work. And then also specifically, how do we collectively address our need for bicultural, bilingual mental health services, because there is a shortage of access to folks all across the board, people who have means and people who don't have means. So I think this was a really fantastic exercise and really generated, in our group, kind of like a lot of great ideas and conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I did wish we had a little more time to talk. We had such a great conversation.
Ernesto, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I did want to say something. Thank you for that. I did want to acknowledge a lot of folks talked about the impact of the pandemic, but it's easy to blame the pandemic on everything. But in spite of that, a lot of good things happened last year too. I think people mobilized. You guys all did a lot of good work out there, so we don't want to ignore that and not forget that. A lot of good things happened. But here we are coming at the end, and we have a little bit of a major uptick in violent crime. But we can't lose sight of the fact of all the good work that has been done over the past year, and I thank you for that, all of you.
I just wanted to point out, coincidentally, I was sent a message to Magali. If you look at the Press Democrat today, there's a headline that talks about how much money you need to make per hour to rent and across the United States, and it drills into, of course, Sonoma County. It says you need to make at least $38.38 an hour to rent a 2-bedroom apartment here. Like, that's just mind blowing. So if that's not timely for this discussion, I don't know what is. So anyways, check it out on today's Press Democrat. It literally just came through.
Thank you, Serena. I think, Madeline, if you wanted to restart the PowerPoint, I think we're ready.
Okay, so we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so next steps. Thank you everybody for that great information. So something that we are going to be looking at collectively is, really keeping our eyes on the indicators and community safety, sharing program performance and client outcomes, engaging community in turning the curve. That is something that's going to be, I think, something you'll see a lot more is the violence prevention team and our partners really more in community as, the city allows us to do that, in person and virtually. And we can talk more too about some of the open houses that we want to have, and really giving community an opportunity to ask us questions and also inform us on where we are. Are we visible enough? Do people know about these services? Do people know about our partners? All of that good stuff. So next slide, please. Okay. So here, so by the end of the year, we'll be unveiling this online platform that we've been talking about that states our desired results and tracks both the community indicators and, program. Oh, sorry. So sorry, I'm losing my Zoom box here. We're going to be mindful of the environment, and we're going to, instead of having all these paper reports and printing all this stuff out, we're going to be doing all of this electronically. So the scorecard, the program evaluation reports are all going to be online, and we'll be using this tool to track our progress. We'll have updated data on 4 indicators, the ones that Holly described, and that'll carry us through the end of this grant cycle. We'll also have quarterly updates from our funded programs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, please. Okay, so programs will now be reporting on how their clients are doing quarterly. We'll be able to see how much the programs are accomplishing in terms of how many youth or families that have been served, and data that shows that families are better off after we've helped them. And all this will be put together on one screen with the strategy and the community indicator, so we can clearly see how our collective work points to one goal of youth thriving. But most importantly, we have new tools for talking about how our work strategically comes together. Next slide, please. So we want to develop a common language and a community platform for sharing information, and I think this is definitely going to be the way to engage a broader community to support our work. And our goal is to show Santa Rosa and our community large, even in the county, that collectively the action that Measure O is, the work that Measure O has done, as a partnership, as all the folks that make part of Measure O, that the funding has been used in a way that has had great return on investment and great impact in the community. And this is especially important for us to consider when working with residents to pass a new tax measure. We recognize, we are totally in a brand new landscape, as Holly was talking about earlier, with this community's unique compounded traumas. So I think it's this work has become even more urgent, even more important than it ever was. So we want to thank you for your continued partnership in this work, and we're looking forward to returning and talking to you a little bit more about it in the coming months ahead. So I think we are at the very end of our presentation. If anyone has any questions. Ed, any questions at all? Yes, Gina.
Are you looking at using any of the Youth Truth data from, the Youth Truth? So you incorporating that at all in your thinking and analysis?
I'll take that question if you don't mind, Magali. Yeah. But I personally have not yet been able to see the Youth Truth survey results because they haven't shared the report out widely. They did a presentation about it where they showed a webinar, but they didn't share the report just yet. I have it on my list to keep checking to see when it comes out. So if anyone hears about it, please send it my way. And then I'd like to review it. If there are any indicators that match up with the topic areas we're interested in, I would definitely bring that back to the group. And then just in general, we want to understand the story behind the curve. So we could do something like say, well, we've read the voices of the youth, here are the concerns they have. This could be part of the story. So we could include that on our platform as well and say, here's some other data that we have, some other information that's important to consider. So thank you, Gina, for bringing that up. If you get access to the report, please share it with me. I need it.
Well, I'll see what I know. I've seen what they have online too, and I was at the presentation. And then we're going to get our own. When I say we, I mean the County Board of Education will be getting our own presentation. I'm not sure if it's. I'm sure if we're getting it at the August meeting or what, but we asked to come. Didn't have a presentation to us about it, so we should, because I know we helped fund the CTE Foundation, and they helped fund that, and SCO, we had a partnership role in it. So I don't know why the full report isn't out, because maybe there's still some final edits. I don't know, because the whole idea was to engage a lot of the same partners you're talking about. So.
And Gina, I've seen a presentation, and the information that was shared in that has really kind of activated a lot of conversations that, you know, the violence prevention team has been having, especially around the very specific type of trauma that our youth in Sonoma County have, in light of the fires, pandemic, housing instability. So pretty unique factors to our community. So definitely to Holly's point, as soon as that comes out, we'd love to be able to get into it more, and have more conversations around that. Thank you. Any other questions for my team? Comments? As Nick Dalton says, petite annoyances.
I want to thank Holly and Allison for their help on this. It was tremendous. Thank you. Thank you for your work on this.
It's a partnership. I love
Yes.
that. The partnership. That's what we need.
I am going to put a link in the chat to our training page on upstream investments. If you're interested in learning more about results-based accountability, you can sign up for one of our summer trainings, or we will be posting our fall training calendar soon. So I'll keep this group updated about those opportunities.
Wonderful. So if there are no other questions, or if a question comes up, you know, please reply to the email that you received this link on. And we're really looking forward to having more conversations and learning together. And just a quick plug, if you've not heard, but our operations team is having the opportunity to do more trauma-informed care work through the workshops and our partnerships with Hannah Institute. So we're very excited about that, just to kind of further push the message along that we are doing our best to continue the educational component, right? There's always something we could learn. There's always a skill that we can build in the work that we're doing. So I appreciate everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.